Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm very excited to be here.
Okay, so introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us why you wanted to write Smart, Not Loud.
Well, thank you so much. So, my name is Jessica Chen, and I'm a former Emmy award-winning television journalist. That was actually my career for about 10 years. And I was working at all the big stations that you can think of, the ABCs, NBC. I was in New York City for a few years. And it's interesting because when I started out as a journalist, and this story is important to explain why I do the work that I do now, which is communications. But when I started out as a journalist, communications was not something I was good at, and I'm very transparent about it. Part of it was cultural, part of it's personality. I consider myself being raised in an environment where communicating, speaking up, putting yourself out there, it wasn't something that my parents told me or even encouraged me to do. But if you can imagine starting out working in a very loud newsroom, you're suddenly surrounded by a lot of charismatic, extroverted, very well spoken people. And honestly, I felt stuck. I didn't know how to pitch my story ideas. I didn't know how to speak up in meetings. Presentations, oh my gosh, it was terrifying. But I always joke, starting out in journalism, in news, was probably the best training ground to learn how to be a better communicator. So after about 10 years working in that industry, winning an Emmy Award and all that cool stuff, I realized that there was so much that I could take from the communication skills that I learned to teach it to professionals. So about 5-ish years ago, I decided to leave and start my own company, Soulcast Media. And we focus now exclusively teaching professionals how to elevate their communications, executive presence, advocate for themselves. And the reason why I wrote the book was because in doing the work at Soulcast Media, I realized there were a lot of reoccurring themes of the kinds of struggles people would experience that I wanted to highlight in this book because I couldn't find something like it out there. There's a lot of communications book, but not like the one that I've written, which we can talk about later.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like a lot of authors and entrepreneurs, normally it's like what pushes you to write this thing or create this thing, build this thing is because they were looking for it and they couldn't find it, right? And so to your point, and I also like the distinction between journalism and communications, and they're different. And there's a great book called Smart Brevity, and it's interesting. We just read it as part of my work book club, and it's like this is the whole concept of communicating in terms of also written communication, verbal communication. Like communication is so big, you know what I mean? And I guess is the point I'm getting to. And so I can understand it feeling a little lost with that. Um, okay, so explain what quiet culture is and the role it plays in people showing up at work. This is, I mean, you are, oh, and by the way, your book is called Smart Not Loud. We're going to put the links to that in the show notes, but also quiet culture is something you talk about in there. So let's talk more about that.
Yes. So I mentioned how there are tons of communications books out there. Anybody can find a communications book, but the kind of communications book that I wanted to look for was something that was written for a person who don't like, for example, for me, I don't consider myself like assertive, loud, dominant type. Like that's just not my style. And I still wanted to figure out though, could I still get opportunities, build visibility if I'm not the first one to speak, if I'm not that quote unquote loud person in the workplace. So, in researching and writing my book, I put this distinction between quiet culture and loud culture, but more specifically, how we were raised, because I think a lot of how we show up in the workplace today has a lot to do with what our parents taught us, or what our caregivers taught us of like, oh, this is how you need to show up at school, show up at work. And so quiet culture traits are being taught things like you listen more than speak. You focus on doing the work and working hard, being studious. You don't really seek the spotlight because nobody likes that. And you generally try to avoid conflict to maintain a harmonious environment. These principles were principles I was taught growing up as a young child. So quiet culture traits. But when I started working, and this is, I think, in a lot of corporate workplaces, what you see expected and even rewarded are what I called loud culture traits. So loud culture traits are being able to speak up a lot and quickly, being able to talk about yourself and talk about your wins, socializing and not shying away from conflict. So that's that paradox that I felt when I first started working myself. It's that I was raised to embody quiet culture traits and practice them and these behaviors, but it seemed like what was expected and rewarded was something completely different. So I felt stuck a lot of the times.
That's interesting just because I've heard it described many different ways, but no one has ever brought it back just to like maybe the way you were raised. And to your point, and I'm listening to this and I'm like, a lot of women are raised to be quiet culture too. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation for another day. But let's talk about, I mean, one of the things we want to cover on today's show is about how to advocate for yourself at work. I want to ask you just how important is this to do? Like, is this something that we hear this advice of like, don't forget to advocate for yourself, but is it like a must do, a nice to have? Like in your research and in the communication, what's the role of the advocacy at workplace for people?
Learning how to advocate for yourself is probably one of the most important skills I think you can learn when you're working. But I know for many of us, doing so is awkward or we just don't know how exactly to approach it, especially if you were taught to either not advocate for yourself, not put yourself out there, or even not seek the spotlight. And so in the book, I talk about how it's very important for us to reframe how we approach work. And I'll give you an example. Many of us go into work and we work hard, we're ambitious, we get our, projects done, we meet our deadlines, like we're good workers, right? And that's fantastic. But I feel like in the working world, and especially the higher up you go, just working hard, that enough is not going to get you those opportunities,
Yeah.
especially those bigger opportunities. And the reason why I say that is because working hard, hitting your deadlines, that's status quo. That's expected. A company hires you to, of course, do a good job. But the other half, and this is the half of advocating for yourself and building visibility, this is equally as important. And so in the book, I talk about how advocating for yourself is really embodying four things. And I'll share the four things with folks so they can conceptualize. And it's really easy to remember because I put it into this nice acronym called ACT, ACCT. You have to act at work to advocate for yourself. So ACT stands for the A is you have to ask for what you want. Asking for what you want is probably one of the most important things because you can't assume other people are going to know what you want, or it's even something that you're interested in. In fact, if you care about it, you have to ask for it. So that's the A. The C is now circle back. Circling back and following up is important because you can't assume people will remember. Others are busy with their projects, their deadlines, and following up is often something that we need to do to proactively remind other people, like, hey, this is something I'm still interested in. This is something I care about. In fact, asking is usually just the planting of the seed. It's just like, hey, FYI, because many times people can't even give a decision right on the spot. So circle back. Next is the other C, which is celebrate. Celebrate your wins. This is actually my favorite one because I feel a lot of us don't do this enough, and I want us to do this. Celebrating your wins means not just doing the work and doing a great job, but trying to figure out how can you talk about that amazing work you just did? Who needs to know about it? How can you talk about the work with other people, other departments to build more visibility? And I know for folks, it can be like, oh, but I don't want to be the boastful type, the look at me type. And I get it. And sometimes all you have to do is just do a, hey, FYI, check this out. Or, hey, look at this. I finished this project and look how it helped streamline this process for all of us. Sometimes that's all you have to do. And then finally, the T. T is turn down requests, basically saying no. And saying no, I think, is huge for advocating for ourselves because sometimes if we say yes to too many things, which for many of us we do because we want others to like us, we want to be seen as a team player, and that's great. But sometimes if you say yes to too many things, you're taking time away from things that actually matter. So, ACCT, you got to act at work to advocate for yourself.
I love that. I'm obsessed with a good acronym, and I couldn't agree with more of the points you have. In fact, I recently started a new job, and I published something for the content property I'm in charge of, and I love it because I kind of like let a couple people know. Slack is like the world that we live in at my job. I let some people know via Slack, and my manager was the one that was like, "I challenge you to announce your news of collaborating with this other team and publishing this thing in the entire marketing Slack channel." And my initial reaction was like, "Is this a big enough deal for the marketing Slack channel? Like that seems like." When you do these big initiatives. And I'm really happy that she encouraged me to do that because, to your point, it's advocating for yourself. And so I share this story so that anybody who's feeling like, oh, I don't want to be like self promotional. I think a reframe for me is like you're being self expressive. You are expressing the thing that you did and sharing it. Obviously, sharing it on Slack feels a lot easier than, maybe raising your hand in a meeting, but also just want to put that challenge out there to other people because it was not something I thought about. It's something I'm really happy I did. And also, to your point, I think that advocating is like a muscle, and the more you use it, the stronger it gets. So you have to act. Like keeping that acronym in places or it top of mind is really important.
I totally agree. And the way I see it too is if you're excited about something because you finished this project and you're pretty proud of it, if you're excited about it, generally speaking, other people are going to be excited for you too. So don't think like, oh, it's a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. So you have
Yeah.
to see it in that way.
Yeah, and I like that one of your tips is like sending FYIs and circling back or following up, which I know we all kind of make fun of these things in work culture, but the squeaky wheel gets greased. And when you politely or respectfully follow up with people, I think you actually like truly that is how work gets done, especially in these like distributed, hybrid remote workplaces. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, the idea of following up, I know can feel very like uncomfortable for people because it's like circling back, following up. So it's
Yeah.
like, how can you do it? So actually, the one tip that I share with following up is when you do follow up, can you offer something new in that follow up, a new piece of information, a new piece of insight to make it fresh and timely? So it's not just a following up, right? And I think just adding a sentence or two to make it fresh and timely, that already makes it so much more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, such good tips. So just to reiterate, your tips for advocating is it's not a nice to do, it's a must do. It's how you control your career brand. I do want to talk about that a little bit more with your tips. How does advocating and speaking up for you actually play a role in your career brand? Which is, I love the phrasing of that. I guess people often think of it as your personal brand, career brand. Same thing. How does advocating and speaking up play a role in that?
Yes, it's funny because when I was writing the book, I was very strategic in not calling it personal brand. I personally don't like saying the words personal brand. I was like, actually, it feels more like career brand because we're talking about our career and advancing our career. So I have a whole chapter, literally, it's called Shaping Your Career Brand. And so I talk about how shaping your career brand is a very proactive and empowering way of controlling the narrative of what people think of you. And I
Hmm.
think a lot of us, when we think about career brand, it's kind of like, well, isn't it just the job I was hired to do? Isn't it just like the projects my manager tells me to do? Can I really control it or even change it? And I absolutely say you can. Of course, the role you're hired in and the projects you do, that all plays a part in it. But I do believe if you are interested in something or you want to be seen as an expert in something, you actually can control the kinds of projects you get assigned to do. And so I have another framework that I'll just run through really quickly about, how you can do it, but it's really identifying what I call your differentiating factor. Your differentiating factor essentially is what you enjoy doing, what you love doing, and what comes easy to you. And it's something that you actually would want to be known for. once you've identified your differentiating factor, and there's like a whole like introspective, Q&A to help you identify this, but once you've identified your differentiating factor, it's now like, okay, how can I create more opportunities around it? And when I say opportunities, I mean, what projects do you need to be on to help hone this skill? How can you be consistent with pitching certain ideas that's relevant to your differentiating factor? And if there's no such projects or opportunities, how can you create your own? And I'll give a story to kind of crystallize this because I did this myself when I was a journalist. When I first started out, I was what we call a general assignment reporter. And that's just you cover everything, politics, business, the community issue that's going down the street, what's happening in City Hall, right? You cover everything. But deep down inside, I was very interested in business and covering business news, business stories, markets, and things like that. And I knew that if I just went up to my manager and I was like, hey, can I just cover business news? He would just be like, absolutely not. You have to cover all the other things, that we hired you for. But because this was something I cared about and I wanted my career brand to at least start going that direction, what I ended up doing was every time we had a team meeting, I would at least pitch one business story consistently every day. Whether it was done or not, it was a fact that I was showing that I was researching these stories and I cared about it. And then soon after, people started to see me as, oh, Jessica, she likes doing business stories, so we'll just give it to her. And then soon after that, because I did it so well, I was able to create my own show, a business show, and that kind of stuff. So the idea is whatever it is that you want to be known for right now at work, maybe it's kind of what you're doing, or maybe it's a little bit different from what you're currently doing. Whatever it is, how can you expand it so other people know about it?
Yeah, I feel like sometimes too, just start talking about it, like to the person at the at coffee in the morning, by the coffee machine, having like, there's always something in a Microsoft team or Slack channel where it's like, here's this random article I read that people might like, or a podcast I listen to. So yeah, to your point, maybe you're pitching stories and it works in your day-to-day work, but maybe it's also just that you're always talking about this and we know you have an interest about it, right? Like I think there's and to your point, you have full control over that, which is really, really good. One important thing in advocacy that you talked about in your tips is saying no. And I think that's a real tough one for people. And I know you have a great framework for that. So can you teach us how to say no with confidence without tons of self-doubt and like kind of like overthinking it nonstop? And why it's important for this like self-advocacy part that we're trying to build.
Of the ACCT acronym, the T, which is turning down requests, is arguably the hardest to do. And it's the one I do get the most questions on because I think a lot of people are very interested in wanting to learn how to do it, but it feels incredibly hard. So there's a framework that I share, which is if you do want to turn down requests, you really want to think about three things. The first one is your tone of voice. How you turn down a request very much is in how it sounds too.
Yeah.
The other thing is what I call explaining why you can't do this one thing right now. And the other one is follow up with options. Because if somebody's asking you to do something, they need help with the project, they need assistance, big or small, chances are it's because they really need that help. But you don't want to give the impression that you're not a team player or that you don't care. So following up with options means where else can they go? So here's like a way I would phrase it. Thank you so much for reaching out or asking about this project that you need help on, but I can't get to it right now because of a huge deadline I have to finish by next week. But if you follow up with me in about 2 weeks, I'll have more time. So just in that one or two sentence, it's like in my tone of voice, I'm still showing that I hear you, I acknowledge you, and I want to help you, but maybe right now is not the right time. So I'm giving you options. So I would want people when they're turning down requests to always remember tone, explain, and follow up with options. Now, a lot of times people are like, well, I just cannot say no because maybe it's a fire that I have to put out at work, but it isn't something that I want to keep doing. right? So how can you let others know? Because in some ways, this is not really, I mean, it is sort of turning down requests, but maybe not in that moment because for whatever situation. So I would say being judicious with when and what you say no to is also quite important. You can't always be the yes person, but you can't always be the no person either. Otherwise, that's not good for the impression that you're going to make, right, at work. So sometimes, depending on the situation, if somebody's asking you to do something and it's a, let's say, yeah, a thing that must be done and it's nothing that you can really say no to, right? I say in that moment, do the project or do that thing that someone's asking you to do. Once you finish it, right? Once it's completed and put away, I would say try to schedule a one-on-one meeting with that person and explain to them that how you're happy to help them with that, but it's not necessarily something that you want to keep doing in that specific way. So I think having that meeting, having that conversation is very important for them to also understand your boundaries too.
This is really funny because this reminds me of like, I have toddlers at home. I know you have a toddler where it's like try to say no without saying no to the toddler so they don't lose their mind. Because if you say no to a toddler, they just, you guys, they turn into creatures. It's crazy. That scream and loud. Anyway, and so this makes me think of this. I had to go to this parenting class as part of a preschool thing once, and it was all about setting limits, not rules, how to basically offer alternatives instead of no. It definitely fell into like gentle parenting vibes if anybody follows this kind of stuff. And I feel like we're saying the same thing kind of at work, like saying no without saying no, watching your tone and how you say no. You can't always be the no person. You can't always be the yes
Mhm.
person. And I also interviewed someone on time management years ago, and I think she made a really good point. Like if you're saying there's an opportunity cost to saying yes to everything also. And so if you're saying yes to all these things that she used the 1 to 10 scale, and like 10 is like the life changing stuff that you won't really want to do, but there's probably less invites for those things. She's like, if you're saying yes to all these things that are in like a 1 through 3 category, you are literally taking up space. So they're, the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 type events or asks or requests, you just literally don't have the bandwidth to do. And so that's something I think about too, is like, I'm not saying yes to this. Maybe I don't even have necessarily a reason why I can't do it other than I want to leave space in my life, my calendar, my whatever, to be able to say yes to the 7, 8, 9, 10 type projects. And I think that's also a good reframe of just sort of time management in general. Like, her comment was about this person who she was telling a story about a person who was like so busy, had no time to do anything, and then their washer broke or something, and so they had spent all day fixing the washer. And she's like, so you had time, you were able to fit it in. So anyway, my point being is like what you're saying is so well taken, and another way to reframe it for people, if you're like, I really struggle with saying yes, I say yes to too many things, is like, well, then you might be missing out on bigger things you don't even know about too, which is not what we want, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, I want to wrap up by talking about you have these 4 cultural reframes that we can use for self-reflection. Self-reflection is definitely a theme that we've talked about on the show. I also think it's kind of goes into this like self-advocacy work, is also self-reflection. So talk about these reframes and what they are.
Yes. So in the book, I talk about there are 4 cultural reframes that we will want to think about, especially if we tend to be the not the assertive type, the dominant type, the very loud type. And because the whole thesis and argument in the book is if you're quiet, do you have to be loud? Or if you're loud, you have to be quiet? And the answer is no. It's not about changing who we are. It's still being able to show up in the workplace in a way that feels right. But it's thinking about work with a little bit more strategy. So the reframes is really to help you with that. So the 4 cultural reframes are in 4 different categories, and I'll share the 4 categories and what the reframes are. So the first category is what I call engaging others. So when you think about your communications, when you're engaging with people, don't think about it as do I speak or do I not speak? Do I say something or not? Do I keep quiet or it's not like a black and white. It's
Yeah.
more like when I do communicate, how can I make sure I'm talking about how impactful this idea or this message is? How can I tailor my message so it resonates with my audience? The question that you have to ask is, well, who's listening, and what do they care about. So it's not about, do I say something or do I not say something? It's how. How can I actually say something so it lands? So that's the reframe for engage others, not quiet or loud. It's how do I make it impactful? The second category is what I call spend time. So, spend time, in other words, is how we approach work. Now, for those who tend to be on the quiet culture side, a lot of times we go into work mode by just putting our head down, kind of staying in our silo and just getting it done, right? We're not necessarily prioritizing socializing or engaging. And that's the thing. If the networking, the happy hours, if that's not your thing, then that's not what I'm saying you have to do either. So the reframe instead is, how can you take the work that you're doing day in and day out, the small projects and the big projects, and maximize that work? And what I mean by maximizing is, how can you take that work and maybe ask to get on another project, or take that work and pitch an idea that you've been wanting to do? So it's taking work, whether it's something that you want to do or not want to do, but you're doing a good job doing the work and trying to build visibility around it. The third one is handle wins. So this is similar to advocating for yourself, which is celebrating your wins, but this is a cultural reframe because this is how important I feel it is. We have to talk about the amazing work that we're doing, which is handle wins. But it's not in this look at me kind of way, look at how amazing I am, because nobody likes that approach. Instead, you take the work that you've done and you say how it has benefited the team. I spent the last week reorganizing this Excel spreadsheet, and it has completely streamlined the process of how we find A, B, and C. So it's being able to articulate and communicate that, which is part of celebrating your win. And then finally, the fourth category is managing and handling conflict, because most of us don't like conflict. Some people are like, it's just part of the process. But for many of us, we're like, I don't like tricky conversations. It's so awkward. So my whole thing is, instead of shying away and avoiding it, which can hurt credibility, and that's a whole nother thing, it can hurt your credibility if you're hiding. Instead, what I want you to do is ask yourself, okay, when did things go wrong? When did things start to kind of like spiral? Who needs to know what has already happened? So now you're thinking more proactively of how can you communicate versus just being like, oh my God, and feeling stuck. So the four cultural reframes are a more proactive and a new way of approaching work that I feel is more empowering.
Well, we love proactive approaches here on the podcast, so we are the right audience for this. You are like, this is music to our ears, and everything you said is accurate. And I think when I think about how do you implement these things, I think of, like, for example, a weekly practice of sending an end of the week update to your team or to your boss, where you know put in your wins. You talk about, and like, finding ways to take some of the stuff and work it into your regular routine is the way to actually, consistency kind of builds these practices over time. But I completely agree. These are not like one time things, they're consistent, they're proactive. And that is how you direct your career path versus, kind of being that reactive person, which is, again, something we've talked a lot about on the podcast. So, Jessica, I love this conversation. All these tips are so, so good. Let people know where they can find you, follow up with you, the name of your book, where to find it, all the things, and we'll put all of it in the show notes as well.
Yeah. The two main platforms that I'm on are LinkedIn and Instagram, much more on LinkedIn. That's where I share all my communication tips, all my career tips, but also on Instagram. And both you can find me, Jessica Chen page. And the book is called Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. And you can get the book on wherever at your favorite bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, independent bookstores, and it's available right now.
Amazing. So I'll put all that in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Lauren.